Welcome to Carrasco by Danny Tomorrow. Imagine for a moment that you're flying into the largest city in the Pacific Northwest. The plane descends over jagged snow-capped mountains, banking over a sparkling, deep blue inlet. The intercom crackles to life, and the pilot says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Welcome to Carrasco." Carrasco. Say it loud. It feels different in the mouth, doesn't it? It has a rhythm, a pulse, that completely alters the identity of the city. Some of you might be thinking, what's Carrasco? And a few of you might be thinking, wait, isn't that your name? For years I lived out in Pitt Meadows, driving the highways of the lower mainland and cruising down the Lougheed, looking out at the exact same jagged peaks and deep waters the explorers drew on our very first maps. I even spent years teaching the Spanish language, preserving the very words that the British Empire tried to scrub from those coastal charts. It's a profoundly surreal feeling to walk through a metropolis, to look at the street signs and the bridges, and to know that your own name is the ghost haunting the foundations of the city. But I'm not here to talk about my family tree. I'm here to talk about the man who actually charted those waters of the city we know today as Vancouver. We know it by the name of Captain George Vancouver, the British Royal Navy officer who charted its inner harbors in 1792. But what if I told you that the name Vancouver is not an inevitability of history? What if I told you that it is the result of a massive, highly successful public relations campaign by a specific group of immigrants who came, took over, and meticulously erased their competition? Today I want to take you into an alternate timeline, a timeline that was only a few map strokes away from becoming our reality, a timeline where the city is named after the first explorer who set eyes on it. His name was Juan Carrasco. Juan Carrasco was a Spanish naval officer and explorer, mapping the very same waters, breathing the very same Pacific air, before the British machinery of empire completely rewrote the map. And by looking at the alternate timeline, we are going to expose the truth about British colonialism in Canada that we rarely have the courage to speak about out loud. Let's go back to the late 18th century. Before George Vancouver ever dropped anchor in Burrard Inlet, the Spanish Empire was already charting the Pacific Northwest. In the summer of 1791, a year before Captain George Vancouver arrived, a Spanish schooner called the Saturnina pushed past the San Juan Islands and became the very first European vessel to enter what we now call the Strait of Georgia. The ship was captained by José María Narváez, and his pilot and cartographer was Juan Carrasco. Carrasco wasn't just a passenger, he was charting the unknown. He was the one who took the data from this groundbreaking voyage and drew the master map. This document, often referred to by historians simply as the 1791 Carrasco map, charted southern Vancouver Island, the San Juan Islands, and the Strait of Georgia. They even noted massive amounts of fresh water in the ocean, correctly guessing a massive river was nearby what we now know as the Fraser River. Fast forward to 1792, George Vancouver sails into the Pacific Northwest. But he wasn't just there to draw maps for fun. The British government sent him with two very specific orders. First, a diplomatic mission to resolve a territorial dispute with Spain, known as the Nootka Crisis, and second, an exploration mission to establish a dominant British cartographic presence. Vancouver fully believed he was charting virgin territory for the British Crown, but while exploring the area, Vancouver bumped into another Spanish expedition, led by Dionisio Alcala Galiano and Cayetano Valdez. Because the Nootka Convention forced Spain and Britain to play nice, the commanders of both fleets were required to be diplomatic. So they sat down together, shared a meal, and crucially shared their maps. The Spanish rolled out the charts from the 1791 expedition, historical records indicate that George Vancouver was absolutely mortified. Staring at Carrasco's map, Vancouver realized the devastating truth. He had been beaten. He wasn't the heroic pioneer he thought he was. He was just the second guy to arrive. And what happened next was the perfect metaphor for colonialism. Because they were gentlemen, Vancouver and the Spanish captains agreed to share their data and work together for the next 3 weeks. Vancouver took a long, hard look at Carrasco's map, copied the data. He used the Spanish charts to navigate the dangerous shoals and narrow channels that would have taken him months to figure out on his own. Carrasco's genius allowed Vancouver to fast-track his entire mission. In July, the British and Spanish ships politely parted ways. Galeano and Valdez went back to Mexico, where the Spanish imperial bureaucracy was slowly crumbling. They filed Carrasco's map away in the naval archives in Madrid, where it gathered dust. George Vancouver, however, sailed back to London. He had the backing of an ascendant, hyper-aggressive British Empire that understood the power of the printing press. Vancouver published a massive, highly publicized atlas. When he drew the final map that would be distributed to the world, he used all the knowledge he gained from Carrasco's work, but he stripped away almost all of the Spanish names. The Spanish Canal de Nuestra Señora del Rosario became the Strait of Georgia, a body of water by the Spanish that they had specifically named Boca de Carrasco to honor Juan was overwritten, known today as Barclay Sound. An island initially named Isla de Carrasco was crossed out and renamed Protection Island. He named the mountains after his friends, he named the waterways after his officers, and he named the land after himself. Even the beach, where he felt that crushing mortification when he first saw Carrasco's map, Vancouver didn't name it after the Spanish captains. Today it's just called the Spanish Banks, a vague, almost anonymous nod to the people who actually did the work first. In other words, the British didn't win the Pacific Northwest because they were the first, or the bravest, or the most destined. They won because they brought the biggest bureaucratic eraser. And that brings us to the core of our historical amnesia. In Canada, we have a very specific, almost polite way of talking about our history. We talk about the British not as colonizers, but as a kind of a natural default setting for the nation. But we forget that the British were immigrants. They were foreigners who arrived with a highly organized, lethal system of assimilation. British colonialism was unique because it wasn't just about planting a flag, it was about cartographic dominance. When you name a mountain, a river, and a city after your own military officers, you weren't just claiming the land, you're rewriting its psychological reality. By naming the city Vancouver, the British Empire accomplished two things. They permanently silenced the legacy of rival explorers like Juan Carrasco, and they superimposed the European Anglo-centric identity over the indigenous Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. When we say Vancouver, British Columbia, we are reciting a 200-year-old colonial incantation. We are verbally reinforcing the idea that the British belonged here and that everyone else, the Spanish, the indigenous peoples, and the later waves of immigrants, are just guests in Georgia's city. If the city had been named Carrasco, the entire cultural paradigm of Western Canada might have shifted. Think about it. The Anglo-Saxon rigidity that defined early Canadian politics would have been fractured from the start. Carrasco sounds kind of vibrant. It ties the Pacific Northwest not to damp gray bureaucracy of London, but to the broader complex history of the Americas, linking it culturally to California, to Mexico, and to the massive Hispanic history of the Western Hemisphere. If we lived in Carrasco, we would be forced to acknowledge that Canada is not just a British experiment. We would see that European arrival was a chaotic collision of empires, and more importantly, the name Carrasco really is a glitch in the matrix. When you realize that the city could just as easily have been named after a Spanish sailor, you suddenly realize how arbitrary all colonial names are. And that is the history-shattering insight. If Vancouver could have been Carrasco, then the British claim to permanence is kind of an illusion. We rarely speak about the brutality of British colonialism because it hid behind the facade of civilization. It hid behind parliamentary procedure, tea times, and map-making. But taking over a continent and renaming every rock and tree after your own kings and captains is an act of supreme aggression. So by resurrecting the story of Juan Carrasco, we don't just swap one European colonizer for another. We use him as a crowbar to pry off the British label. Now I want to leave you with a curious thought before I end this. When you look closely at the sheer mathematical impossibility of the coincidences required to erase Juan Carrasco from history, it almost feels like the timeline was tampered with. Now hear me out. It's almost as if an invisible hand reached into the late 18th century with a very specific choreographed mission. Make sure the British get that map. Because you can't just blow up a ship to change history. That leaves a footprint. To rewrite a timeline seamlessly, you just have to adjust a few tiny variables. You just have to set up the dominoes. Think about the flawless sequence of events that had to align perfectly to orchestrate that chance encounter at the Spanish banks, where they were able to get a hold of Carrasco's map. Event number 1. The 1791 outbreak. Juan Carrasco was on the very verge of finishing his master map the year prior. He was right there. But just before he could finish the job himself, a localized outbreak of scurvy suddenly sweeps through his ship, forcing him to turn back to Mexico. Event number 2. The bureaucratic downgrade. When the Spanish send the follow-up crew in 1792 to finish Carrasco's work, someone in the Spanish Naval Command makes some baffling decision. Instead of sending fast, capable frigates, the captains are assigned the Sutil and Mexicana, two terribly slow, shallow draft riverboats. It's a logistical error that perfectly, flawlessly delays their progress up the coast. Event number 3, the sudden detour. Captain George Vancouver is under strict diplomatic orders from the British Crown to sail straight to Nuka Sound. But at the last possible second, a sudden, illogical urge takes hold of him. He takes a detour. He decides to go check out the Strait of Juan de Fuca first. It is an impulsive choice that puts him exactly where he isn't supposed to be. And then event number 4, the weather dial. The trap is set, both ships are in the same massive body of water at the exact same time, but this is the Pacific Northwest, and the marine layer is blinding. If the fog stays thick, they pass like ghosts in the night, entirely unaware of one another. But on the morning of June 21st, the fog had just happened to lift by exactly 10%. Almost too perfect, like someone quietly tweaking the dials of reality. And boom, the lookout spots the masts and Vancouver rolls over. The Spanish roll out Carrasco's map and the timeline is successfully altered. Oddly enough, if any of these tiny, seemingly insignificant variables had gone any other way, or if Carrasco hadn't gotten sick, if the Spanish had better ships, if Vancouver had just followed his original orders, or if it had just been a little more cloudy that morning, Vancouver would have never seen the map. He would have been left to navigate the impossible maze of the coast completely blind. He never copies the homework, and the name Vancouver becomes nothing more than a minor, forgotten footnote in the British Imperial Archives. When we look at history, we like to think of it as this solid, inevitable march of progress, but it isn't. History is incredibly fragile. It's a house of cards, dictated by a cough, a bad boat, an impulse, and a break in the weather. It's written by the people who managed to capitalize on those glitches. So as you walk out here today and look up at the street signs, the mountains, and the name of your beautiful city, I want you to remember how easily the name could have been different. I want you to remember the cartographer who actually did the work, not just the person who stamped their name on top of it. The goal is not to replace one memory with another. The goal is just to widen the frame. Because when we widen the frame, we begin to see Canada not as a finished story, but as a layered one. A place shaped by Indigenous nations and immigrants from every corner of the world. And maybe somewhere in a timeline, just 1 inch from ours, the pilot's touching down and saying, "Welcome to Carrasco." Thanks for listening. Goodbye.